Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar, Don't Get Lost in the Forest, Using a Theory of Change to Set a Clear Path to Desired Outcomes. I'll now introduce our presenters for today. With more than 20 years of experience in child welfare at the local, state, and national levels, Tori Russell's work has been concentrated in the areas of capacity building, continuous quality improvement, intervention development and implementation, and building evidence in child welfare. With 14 years of experience in child welfare at the local, state, and national levels, James Coloma's work has been concentrated in the area of child welfare training and evaluation, capacity building, and intervention development and implementation. Mary Jane Peck is a child welfare specialist with more than 10 years of experience in training and technical assistance related to implementation, continuous quality improvement, and strategic planning. I will now turn it over to Tori Russell to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to be here to talk about developing a theory of change. Today, we're going to quickly go over the objectives of this event. We're going to talk about the key elements of a theory of change. We're going to go over a few different methods of developing a theory of change and a few important things to keep in mind. And then we're going to break out into small groups to talk about theory of change in practice.
Other agenda items are as follows: laying the foundation and identifying long-term outcomes, developing the pathway to change using the staircase method, the so-that method, and multiple root causes, defining actions, not strategies to prevent them, common missteps and strategies to prevent them, and facilitated breakouts, which also include a Q&A session and closing resources.
Our objectives today are to make sure you have a clear understanding of the components of a good theory of change and how to create one. We also want to talk about some of the common mistakes people make when developing a theory of change. And finally, we want to give you an opportunity to connect with peers while connecting this discussion to practice. We've titled this session, Don't Get Lost in the Forest, Using a Theory of Change to Set a Clear Path to Desired Outcomes. I'm guessing that everyone here today has had an experience where you've had a problem and you've been able to envision what it would look like if that problem didn't exist, but you had no idea how to get there. Developing a theory of change helps to identify a pathway or map to follow as you work towards solving your problem. It's part of the process of addressing identified problems or needs in a planful, structured, strategic way that can be monitored and evaluated so we know what is working and what is not working as we try to improve outcomes for children and families.
Developing a theory of change diagram shows a ring of circles. The green outer circle is labeled readiness. The blue inner circle has 6 lines extending from the outer edge. There are 3 lines on each side of the circle. All contain text that reads, from the left side to the right side, monitoring, evaluating, and applying findings, intervention testing, piloting, and staging, and implementation planning and capacity building. Then, problem exploration, theory of change, and intervention selection and design/adaptation.
We all know, though, that doing this work can be very difficult. To help, the Capacity Building Center for States is developing the Change and Implementation Practice Series. Using existing research, guidance, and literature that is very likely familiar to all of you, we've developed the How-To Practice Series containing 9 briefs. The graphic on the screen provides an overview of the topics in the series. Today we're talking about the second brief in the series, Developing a Theory of Change. It's important to note that the first brief on problem exploration is foundational to developing a theory of change. If you haven't reviewed that brief yet, we've provided both a link to the center website that contains the problem exploration brief, and we've attached the brief here in the pod on the right side of the screen, the resources pod. The theory of change brief is also located in the pod and will be placed on the website following this session. On the slide are 5 essential functions in developing a theory of change. Gather information on the problem and the root cause and the target population, which is the first function, but note that we say gather because you already should have this information about the problem, the root cause, and the target population when you move into a theory of change process. 2 is identifying a long-term outcome. Number 3, developing the pathways of change. 4, defining your actions. and 5, documenting assumptions and rationale. We're going to spend some time today going through each one of these functions with practical examples. We're also going to hear from consultants and experts doing this work in the field to hear how this work can support jurisdictions in implementing effective change initiatives. Before we dive into this work, we want to take a few minutes to get a better understanding of what your experiences are with developing a theory of change. So take a look at the polling question. How familiar are you with the process of developing a theory of change? Go ahead and put your answers into the system now. As the answers are coming in, it looks like most people are somewhat familiar. Okay, that's very helpful to know.
Final polling results. How familiar are you with the process of developing a theory of change? 11.1% responded, very familiar. 55.5% responded, somewhat familiar. 25% responded, a little familiar. 2.78% responded, not at all familiar. And 5.56% responded, I am not sure.
The next question is, has your agency used a structured process like this before to plan and define what actions will impact the changes you are looking to make? Yes or no? And then if you look a little bit further down the screen, it says, if so, were you successful? You can type in an answer there. Okay. So it looks like a lot of you have used a structured process like this before. That's very helpful to know. It's also important to know that the process we're presenting today may look a little different than what you're used to, but I think the common elements will be the same. So it'll be good for us to have some of that discussion in our breakout groups in a little bit.
Final polling results. Has your agency used a structured process like this before to plan and define what actions will impact the changes you are looking to make? 66.6% answered yes. 33.3% answered no. A follow-up question asks, if so, were you successful? Responses include yes, somewhat, use of value stream mapping and A3 problem-solving tools, not sure, new employee, and still in progress.
Okay, a few more questions here. It's going to be helpful for us moving forward if we have a sense of what challenges you encountered when you were writing your theory of change or doing the theory of change work in your systems. If you haven't ever done this before, can you think of any barriers that you think that you can anticipate in doing work like this? Time and resources to do it well, understanding the potential impact of change, willingness of both field staff and leadership to engage in the process and be held accountable for follow-through, absolutely. Those are some of the challenges that various folks anticipate. People with varying understanding of concepts associated with writing the theory of change, resisting the urge to not tie change to problem, but rather to what sites want to implement. Thinking about it from that perspective versus jumping to solutions, yeah, that's one of the biggies. Okay, these are great. A lot of really good answers here. So I think we're all on the same page. Some of the big issues related to theory of change are having different understandings of how to do a theory of change, sometimes getting a theory of change confused with logic model, resisting the urge to just jump into a solution rather than completing a theory of change. I think that's a big problem. I think sometimes jumping into theory of change without having done problem exploration first. This happens a lot. So I think you guys hit on all of the key points here, especially why is it important to do a theory of change and to do this work. So, the first two steps in the change and implementation process that we're presenting in our series of briefs are the foundation of doing this work, exploring a problem and then creating a hypothesis for how do you think you're going to get from the problem to your desired outcome.
Theory of change scenario. Steps are listed as follows. Explore the problem and root cause. Develop a theory of change. And select an intervention that will address the problem to get the desired long-term outcome.
And it's tough sometimes to find the time to do this work, but it's really important. So we wanted to share an example that has probably happened to many of you in real life. So we wanted to take it out of the context of child welfare and put it into the world of healthcare and orthopedics. So imagine that you hurt your knee and you go to the doctor. The doctor could respond to you in a variety of different ways, right? She'd breeze into the room and talk to you for a couple of minutes and give you a prescription for pain meds and send you on your way. She could come in and ask you a few questions and say, well, based on my experience, I think you need surgery, so I'm going to schedule you for next week. Either one of these solutions will address the pain, potentially, but there are a couple of problems there. Number one, neither solution for sure will address the injury itself because we don't really have a clear understanding of what the injury is. So it's really just kind of a shot in the dark. The surgery, shot in the dark. Pain meds, just addressing pain, not addressing the injury. Number two, both of these solutions really could cause more damage than they fix, especially taking the shot in the dark and just doing surgery without really knowing what the injury is. So in this situation, what does a doctor usually do? A doctor usually tries to choose a solution that is the most likely to address the injury. But in order to do that, the doctor needs to understand more about what she needs to do to get to the root cause. So she needs data and information. She needs to know, how did you hurt it? Where's the pain? What pain level are you at? Is there a history of arthritis in your family, knee injuries in your family? Have you been playing, contact sports? What movements cause the pain? And then she needs to look at what the x-rays say, what do the scans say, she did blood tests or anything else like that, what do those things say? And then she's going to come up with a hypothesis. And in this hypothesis, you're going to have a plan or conditions that need to be met in order to get from the root of your problem to your desired outcome. And in order to get to the desired outcome, you know that certain conditions need to exist. You're going to have competent medical care. You're going to need to have adequate insurance or enough money to cost the care, to cover the cost of care. You're going to need the injury to be repaired. Maybe this is through the action of surgery. You're going to need to strengthen the muscles, maybe through physical therapy. You're going to need to reduce the inflammation. This could be through taking medication. You're going to need to make sure the knee is stabilized and that the joint is protected. So you could do this either through the physical therapy and building up the muscles or through wearing a stabilizing device. And then eventually this all leads to the nerves in the knee no longer sending pain signals, which means that you're going to have achieved your long-term goal, a pain-free knee. This is the goal we're shooting for here. If you don't do all of these things and you don't have an understanding of the pathway and your doctor doesn't have an understanding of the pathway, then you don't have a good foundation and a good hypothesis for how are we going to get there, how do we know if we've gotten there, how are we going to measure if we've gotten there, and what are we going to go look at to try and tweak if we haven't gotten there. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Jane to talk a little bit more about developing a theory of change.
Thanks, Tori. So in addition to being a hypothesis to get from the root cause to improved outcomes, teams can also use a theory of change to achieve buy-in, so helping partners and stakeholders get on the same page about what needs to happen to reach their shared goals. They can also use it to set the groundwork for finding the best approach and selecting the intervention that best meets their needs. It's also useful for guiding strategic planning and decision-making throughout the change process. And then finally, it helps inform evaluation and continuous improvement, including identifying the indicators that it can inform evaluation and continuous improvement efforts, monitoring progress to goals, and determining if any adjustments are needed as the solution is implemented. So agencies should consider flexibility and feasibility when developing a theory of change, but a sound theory of change should also be plausible. That is, does the team agree that the logic is correct? And does the team have the data to support the logic? So if we do X and Y, we should get the results we want and expect. They should also be doable. Does the team have access to the resources needed to implement the pathway of change? And they should be testable. Are there credible ways for the team to explore whether predicted results occur? And finally, theories of change should be meaningful. Do the team members and other stakeholders view the outcomes as important and think that expected changes are worth the effort?
So many people often confuse theories of change and logic models and use the terms interchangeably, but they are in fact quite different and used for different purposes. So both are useful, but they're used at different stages. So let's consider the steps in the change and implementation process, and specifically the first four, so we can see where a theory of change and logic model fit. So a theory of change explains why a change is expected to occur, and it shows the pathway from the root cause of the problem to the desired outcome, as Tori illustrated earlier with her example. And it also provides the strategic sort of big picture view and outlines the relationships between outcomes where multiple interventions may be needed to address a problem comprehensively. On the other hand, a logic model is developed once you've identified an intervention, and it helps illustrate program components and identifies the measurable processes and indicators for an intervention. So for example, your inputs, activities, your outputs, which would be your immediate results, and outcomes that occur as a result of your implemented strategies or interventions. So if we think back to our example of a knee injury, the logic model for an intervention might include things like your outputs would be the number of screws inserted in the knee during surgery, the dosage of medication, the hours and the number of sessions for physical therapy, and your immediate outcomes might be reduced swelling, improved motion, and increased muscle strength. So as the team begins the work of developing a theory of change, it's important to revisit what you discovered during problem exploration. After identifying a problem, teams use the process of problem exploration to determine and confirm the root cause or causes and the target population impacted. So you're going to use these three items that you identified during problem exploration: the root cause, contributing factors, and target population. So they're foundational to any change initiative, knowing what you will solve and whose outcome will improve as a result. So taking time to gather, review, and clarify what is learned in problem exploration helps teams prepare for developing a theory of change. So the theory of change is a pathway. So think of the problem statement as the starting point and the long-term outcome as the destination that represents a noticeable change. The long-term outcome answers questions like, what about the problem will change? What will the impact to the target population look like? And how will the team know that their change initiative was successful? Without identifying a long-term outcome, it's difficult for your team to think about what action steps or conditions it might take to realize change and improve outcomes for the target population. So if I'm going on a trip and I don't know my destination, where I'm going, it's difficult to determine, what mile markers should be along the way, how I know I'm on the right track to getting to my final destination. So teams brainstorming long-term outcomes can think about the changing conditions in three different ways. So number one, how will the team recognize the change in people? Will they observe specific behavior changes, increase in knowledge, a demonstration of new or enhanced skills? Two, how will the team recognize change in organizations? Will they see policy changes or culture shifts?
And 3, how will the team recognize the change in systems? Will they spot the enhanced collaboration or improved service accessibility? So once again, outcomes should be specific, measurable, and achievable. So let's take a quick poll here and review some of the potential long-term outcomes. And take a minute to review the choices on the screen in the poll and consider which, if any of them, would be good long-term outcomes to consider. And note that you can select as many as possible that you think are potential long-term outcomes. So as we see results coming in, if we think about specific, measurable, and achievable, the first one, improve safety outcomes for children under age 5 in Region 1. It's specific. I know we're looking at children under age 5 in a specific region, in Region 1, and it's measurable. We want to see improvement in safety outcomes. Same for number 2. We want to see increased placement stability specifically among youth ages 13 to 17. And then improved connections between children and youth in out-of-home care and their birth parents. So specifically, I'm looking for improved connections between children and youth and their birth parents. So specific, measurable, and achievable. And so as you can see, any one of these would probably meet our needs for a long-term outcome that is specific, measurable, and achievable. So if you've noted all of the above or selected any of those, you're correct.
Final polling results. Which of these would be good long-term outcomes to consider? 34.3% answered, improved safety outcomes for children under age 5 in Region 1. 53.1% responded, increased placement stability among youth ages 13 through 17. 15.6% responded, improved connections between children and youth in out-of-home care and their birth parents. 21.8% responded, improve engagement of non-custodial fathers in service planning over the next 2 years, ensuring they receive the services that meet their needs. And 43.7% responded, all of the above.
Thanks, Mary Jane. Now we're going to talk with James Coloma, who's the liaison with the Center for States. James, can you talk to us a little bit about your experiences with gathering information needed on the problem, root cause, and target population, and identifying a long-term outcome in your work with jurisdictions? Talk a little bit about the practice.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So in one of the jurisdictions that I work with, we were working on a project to identify what type of training system is needed in order to increase knowledge and skills of child welfare workers. And this was a jurisdiction that uses outside university partnerships to provide the training, as well as other providers to help to increase knowledge and skills in if they're doing specific implementations on an intervention. One of the ways that we went through doing a root cause analysis was to spend some time talking with and doing some focus groups with the organizations that were either that were providing the training or with the people who were receiving the training. And what we were trying to find out was, one, was the training being effective, and was it being delivered in a way that is helpful to those receiving the training, and was it consistent throughout the entire jurisdiction? So this was a more intensive project in terms of looking at gathering that data and looking at that root cause, trying to really get to a very good understanding about what is happening in terms of our social workers or our child welfare workers getting the necessary knowledge and skills that they need in order to do their work. In another jurisdiction, we were working around them trying to figure out how to increase child welfare outcomes. Primarily, this was a jurisdiction that just went through their CFSR round 3, and around permanency outcomes, we're really failing, or we're not obtaining the outcomes that they were hoping to get. And so in this root cause analysis, we began to look at not just the case reviews that were done during the CFSR, but also began to pull more information from their data, using that as a jumping off point to getting information from their SACWIS system and doing deeper dives of that information. And from that information, helping us to identify where we need to ask questions of either providers or staff or others. So we went through that process in order to get to that root cause. And that helped us to get to long-term, what helped us to identify what our long-term outcome was. For the jurisdiction that around the training issue, their long-term outcome was to really increase knowledge and skills of workers, and really trying to see how to make that system of getting information out quickly to workers, and to make sure that workers were incorporating the use of that information within the field. And I'm sure we'll talk about that theory of change of how we got from that root cause into that outcome a little later. Around the area of increasing outcomes for permanency, this jurisdiction is a state state supervised county administered system. And at the state level, what they were trying to help do with their counties was trying to look at what is their process of providing support to these counties in terms of increasing worker skills and knowledge, or increasing the ways that policies are rolled out. So we help the long-term outcome is really trying to look at their technical assistance model and trying to improve what that looks like.
Thanks, James. That's really helpful. So James and Mary Jane have talked a bit about the problem and root cause of the problem and the long-term outcome. The steps in the pathway to take you from the root cause of the problem to the long-term outcome are called causal links, and they can be tough. Causal links are desired conditions, results, accomplishments, or changes. They are not strategies or actions. You can really think of them as mini outcomes or indicators that tell the story of how success will be recognized at each level in the pathway. Your causal link should tell you things like who or what will change, how much change is needed, and how long it will take to bring about the necessary change. So think about the difference on the slide here. A causal link will be something like agency culture embraces youth voice. This is a condition. It's not going to be an action step like youth are invited to participate at planning meetings. Inviting you to participate at planning meetings might be a good strategy. It might be a good action step, but it doesn't address who or what needs to change or the results that might achieve the outcome. So that is a place, causal links is a place where folks often get tripped up in developing a theory of change. Quite often we see theories of change that have a root cause identified, and then rather than conditions or accomplishments, the pathway is made up of action steps. And that's close, but that's not exactly what we need. We need those causal links that tell us who or what will change, how much change is needed, and how long it's going to take to bring about the necessary change, or other measurable indicators like that. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we do want to provide you with a few different methods for developing a theory of change. The core elements of a theory of change are the root causes of the problem, the long-term outcome, the causal links or pathway from problem to outcome. If you have a simple theory of change with one root cause, a simple method to use is the staircase. The staircase can be used in two ways. You can start with the root cause on the top, like this one here, and have your causal links go down the stairs to the long-term outcome. So it really, in the staircase, the idea is that you have the root cause on one end of the staircase, the long-term outcome on the other end of the staircase, and you stair-step your way either up or down to create a hypothesis for how you're going to address your problem. So let's take a look at this example. let's assume that the root cause here is that child welfare agencies lack access to qualified staff in rural counties. So the question here is, why do child welfare agencies lack this access in rural counties? This is at the top of our staircase where we're starting with our root cause. We answer this question with our research and information to say that this is because the qualification requirements need to be expanded. So we can take this, this statement of the qualification requirements need to be expanded, and we can just transition that into a causal link. We then go to our next question. Well, why do the qualification requirements need to be expanded? Because a broad pool of candidates is needed in rural counties. So then we can create another causal link from that. Well, why is a broad pool of candidates needed in rural counties? Because it will allow more positions to be filled with qualified staff in rural counties, and so on. So we would do this causal link stair-stepping method all the way from the root cause down to the long-term outcome in this particular example. This example shows the flip, which starts at the top with the long-term outcome and then works backward to the root cause. Some people prefer to do it this way.
Building the pathway of change, staircase model. The graphic shows an inverted staircase for the previous example with long-term outcome at the top and root cause at the bottom, rather than the other way around as on the previous slide.
Another method of developing a theory of change is called the so-that method. It may not be called the so-that method, it's what we call the so-that method. And if you've done work with the center, you've probably seen us do this method quite often. The so-that method is sometimes helpful for teams to visualize that each causal link is dependent on the one before it, and can illustrate when there are two causal links that may need to happen at the same time by replacing the connector so that with and to show that the two links occur at the same time.
Building the pathway of change, so that approach. This slide contains 6 boxes, each with an arrow pointing to the one below it. It reads, from top to bottom, root cause. Child welfare agencies lack access to qualified staff in rural counties. Expand qualification requirements to allow for a broader pool of candidates, and increase access to qualified degree programs in rural areas, and support and incentives are available for completion of social work and human services degrees, so that a broad pool of candidates is available, so that more positions are filled with qualified staff in rural areas.
So in this example, we start at the top with the statement, resources are dedicated to improve ineffective parenting practices to connect parents with community resources, social supports, and mental health and substance abuse treatment services. And then we build the first so that link to a more adequate and pro-social environment for children is created. So I don't have to read the whole example, but you can see that the so that process starts with the root cause. Child welfare agencies lack access to qualified staff in rural counties. Then the next is expand qualification requirements to allow for a broader pool of candidates and increase access to qualified degree programs in rural areas, and support and incentives are available for completion of social work and human services degrees so that a broad pool of candidates is available, so that more positions are filled with qualified staff in rural areas.
Putting theory of change into practice. The slide asks the following questions. What method did they choose? Did this work well? What barriers do they face? How are they working through them? How did they achieve stakeholder agreement on the pathway?
Okay, so causal links are not easy, and going through different methods of developing a theory of change is also not easy. So with that, let's check back in with James and get James to talk to us a little bit about how he does the work with developing this pathway of change with states and jurisdictions. James?
Yeah, so in the training example, what we ended up doing was bringing together a team of individuals that were made up of workers and supervisors and staff of the agency to help think through what was that area of change. And we used the method of the stair-step method. So we began with where is it that we wanted to end up? And in the training example, what they were looking at was looking to really increase the fidelity to their practice model. And so to get there, we talked through, all right, well, what needed to happen to get to increase fidelity to the practice model. One of the areas was that, there needed to be some understanding from the supervisors who needed to support the activities of the field, and they needed to have an understanding of what that was, so that they could actively support their workers in terms of looking at whether the practice was being done well, and if not, having to increase the skills of the workers to doing that practice better. As we began to do that, we did notice that while we brought together a team of individuals that included the agency staff and workers who were receiving the training and supervisors, we neglected to bring in the providers of the training. And so one of the things that illuminated to us or highlighted for us was that we needed to do the theory of change, or that we are planning on doing the theory of change again. We're in the middle of developing this theory of change with this organization, but and the reason for that is because of the partners who are delivering the training are the ones that are being contracted to not just deliver it, but also to support the coaching in the field. And one of the root causes that was identified was around that coaching. We are looking to replicate that theory of change together, but using that stair-step method and using that understanding of what was the ultimate outcome, what needed to happen prior to get there, was really helpful in getting to in developing this theory of change. In the notion of the developing of the jurisdiction that was working on increasing outcomes for permanency and looking to think through what their process of providing technical assistance was. Again, it was a team that was brought together that included both state and county individuals to struggle with and to think through, well, what is the ways that, and what are the ways that the state needs to provide technical assistance to the organization, or to the counties. And some of the things that they struggled through was the notion that at the state level that the state level would just release policy to these jurisdictions but not follow it up with any sort of clarification or questions, and that the method of releasing the policies was ineffective in terms that sometimes it just went into an email box and nobody read it, and that these policies weren't getting down to the line level. So the theory of change, again, used, it was a combination of using the so-that method and the stair-step method to identify, well, what needed to happen to increase permanency outcomes and how to focus on from the state level to the county level. So it was a process that incorporated both that notion of asking and looking at and helping staff, the staff that were involved to think through, well, what are the ways or what are those conditions that need to occur prior to certain things happening.
Perfect. Thanks, James. All right. Let's do another poll. Quickly review some of the stuff that we just covered. So in this first question, have you or your team ever developed a theory of change using the staircase method? Have you or your team ever developed a theory of change using a so-that method? Just curious if there are particular methods you're more used to using than others. So it looks like the so-that method is a little more commonly used by this group than the staircase method.
Final polling results. Have you or your team ever developed a theory of change using other methods? 15.6% responded yes. 71.9% responded no. 12.5% responded not sure. Final polling results for the second question. Have you or your team ever developed a theory of change using a so that method? 36.3% responded yes. 42.4% responded no. And 21.2% responded not sure.
And I will turn it back over to Mary Jane. We're going to talk about actions next.
Thanks, Tori. All right, so defining actions is an important next step in developing a theory of change, and it will set you up to identify your intervention. So what do we mean by defining actions? So actions are what needs to happen before each causal link can take place. They're what you're going to do to make that mini outcome a reality. And there could be several actions that you would take. You'll notice that actions are not necessarily an intervention, but they will help teams to begin thinking about important elements of the potential intervention that they will select. So remember, at this stage, we're not yet identifying an intervention or a full program, but just beginning to think critically about what needs to be included in order to reach the desired outcome and how you'll best set the stage for implementing that intervention. So since actions for causal links are often defined through brainstorming sessions, teams may see a need for additional resources or partnerships to think through potential actions for each causal link and how best to achieve them. And it may take you more than one session to consider all of the actions for a pathway, especially if the theory of change is particularly complex or involves multiple root causes. So in the pathway of change, causal links build upon one another. And so in that respect, teams look at each causal link in the pathway in order and consider the actions needed for each. So for example, are the actions for causal link 1 dependent on one another? Understanding these relationships can help teams coordinate efforts and complete actions in the best order. So let's consider an example from the Theory of Change brief that's available for download in your pod. So one of the causal links in the example from the brief is expanded qualification requirements allow for a broad pool of candidates. So some sample actions might be to examine existing qualification requirements for barriers to staffing, research national standards, or modify agency requirements. So you can see that there might be multiple actions that you would take in order to reach that sort of mini outcome on the way to your desired outcome. So as I mentioned, teams should also look at whether there are any barriers that may prevent the action from taking place, and if so, think about what resources or partnerships may be needed to achieve those. So once again, I think it's helpful to bring this together by talking about what it actually looks like in practice. So I'm going to invite James back so he can share some of his experiences working with teams to define actions and specifically talk to us about how they continued to engage team members, the barriers, and how they achieved stakeholder agreement on the action. So James,
Great,
can you talk to us a little bit about that? Yeah.
I sure can. So back to that training example, again, one of the things that was in the theory of change that was noted was that supervisors both did lack the knowledge about what the practice model was, and that they also were, or their skills around how to coach was also needed to be increased. So by having supervisors within this team to help us think through our theory of change, it was a way that they lifted up that they were primary, their involvement in this is really necessary, and that for workers to be going out and looking at and trying to do the practice model, if they don't understand it, if they aren't able to support it, that they may be trying to tell their workers that what they may be doing isn't either being done here at this organization or that they should be doing it differently. So having them be involved in this process allowed us to think through what is the action steps that need to happen to increase the knowledge about the practice model to these supervisors, and how do we begin to build up the skills of these supervisors to engage in a coaching relationship with their workers, and what does that mean? So those action steps that we had to identify was that as we began to, or as the jurisdiction began to expand their implementation of the practice model throughout the entire organization, that the supervisors needed to be trained first and needed to get that basic foundation of what the practice model was. In addition to that, supervisors also needed to understand and needed to build up their skills around what is their, how should they be doing their coaching to their staff. That they needed to get an understanding that as staff began to practice, they needed to be able to have the ability to go out and observe that practice, and we had to build up their skills about how to provide feedback in a way that fit in with the coaching models that they were identifying. So again, it was very helpful to have those who were involved in the process to be part of the discussion and putting together the theory of change. I did speak about earlier that we wanted to bring in a stakeholder, and as we began to move forward and the stakeholders then identified that they should have been involved, that we're going to go back and revisit our theory of change because they're very important in this process as well. And that may also identify other actions that we may need to take.
Great. Thanks, James. I think it's always helpful to hear about what this looks like in practice. So one of the last steps to tie this all together is to document assumptions that support the theory of change and why you think it will work. So teams, as they do this, can consider expectations, contextual issues, and any data or research that supports the theory of change. And so it's intended to provide a clear illustration about how and why the theory of change will work, the connections between each step in the pathway of change. The expectations outline the connections between causal links and actions. Contextual issues consider what resources or barriers there might be, maybe even legislative requirements. And data and research supports assumptions so a team can build the strongest theory of change possible. It's helpful to write up a narrative of the logic and rationale for the theory because it's important to share with stakeholders, decision makers, potential funders of the actions so that they understand the rationale for the theory of change. And it's especially helpful as you move into the next step of selecting an intervention. So it helps provide the explanation of why the team thinks it will work in a clear and concise way and can help engage the various audiences in future steps to address the root cause and the problems identified. So I think it's helpful to talk about some common missteps in theory of change work. And as I talk about these, feel free to type in the chat if you think of some other missteps that maybe you've experienced. So one of them, as we've already noted, is that sometimes people develop a logic model instead. As we talked about earlier, a logic model is done after you have an intervention identified, and it includes the inputs, activities, and outputs. Another common misstep is that a theory of change doesn't actually end up addressing the problem and target population identified. So if the theory of change is done in the absence of all of the good information about the root cause, contributing factors, and target population, then it really can't serve as a reliable roadmap to get to the intended outcome. Another common misstep is identifying actions and strategies rather than causal links, which, as you recall, are those conditions needed for change. So remember that good causal links, they're almost like mini outcomes, as we said. So they're the mile markers on the way to your ultimate outcome, and they should leave room for actions and strategies to help achieve them. So to use another example sort of outside of child welfare, if I were going on a trip to New York City from where I live in Washington, D.C., My mini outcomes or my mile markers might be to reach the cities of Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Trenton, New Jersey. And my strategy would be how I would get there. So I could either drive or take the train or even fly if I wanted to. So finally, a final common misstep is that teams don't have the stakeholders that they need and therefore don't get agreement and buy-in. So as we've noted, it can be helpful to have brainstorming sessions with stakeholders so that they can be actively involved in the development of a theory of change. And then also not acknowledging multiple root causes and how this may impact the theory of change. So as you all are aware, child welfare issues are complex and there are often multiple root causes for problems. So if these multiple root causes aren't considered in the development of causal links, then you may end up with an intervention that doesn't fully address the problem. So now that we've talked about missteps, we wanted to just quickly talk about some of the strategies to help prevent some of these missteps. So just a few to keep in mind. One, ensure you have explored the problem and that you have that information, including the target population and root cause, and you use this as the foundation for the theory of change. So as we've noted, having this information will ensure that you develop the right pathway to your goal. So thinking about my traveling example, if I want to go to New York City for the weekend, it makes a big difference to know whether I'm going to start in Washington, D.C. or Seattle, Washington. My pathway and strategies for getting there might look very different depending on my starting point. Second is to have a diverse team that represents the stakeholders needed to be engaged in this process from the beginning. It's important to have leadership on board as well as those with the skills and the oversight or responsibilities to move the work forward. And then we also want to think about causal links. Remember to focus on the conditions that will help affect change. You might have to give yourself reminders. Is this an action or a strategy? If so, then it's not a causal link.
We are at the end of our scheduled time, so we will be finishing this webinar shortly. Feel free to contact us using our website, capacity.childwelfare.gov/states. That's capacity.childwelfare.gov/STAPES. You can also contact us by our email address, capacityinfo@icf.com. That's capacityin@icf.com. Or by our phone number, 844-222-0272. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.